Open up your Bibles, James chapter 2. James chapter 2. If you are just joining us, you can take out the Bible in the pew back right in front of you. If not, you could just listen to us. You could turn to page 1011. We are working through the book of James, and today's sermon is about loving your neighbor. And the reason why we're going through the book of James is because we as a people, Christians, people who have followed Jesus, we have a major problem. And here's the problem that we have. The problem that we have is our world is increasingly becoming polarized. Our world is becoming divisive. Our world is overwhelmed with violence. If you're just following the news, you know what's happening in Nigeria? There is a mass genocide happening in Nigeria. They're murdering Christians. Islam is taking over Nigeria. Right? What are we supposed to do with that information? When we look at the political climate that's happening right now, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it's not a big kumbaya moment, right? It's not like, how can we work together to make our society best? It's more like the other side is evil and we have to crush them. And this is gonna be the end. If you don't do something now, our world is crashing. What do you do with that type of information? James is going to show us, right? He's going to show us how do we live in the world that we were created to live in? How do we deal with these issues? And one of the things that he's gonna talk about today is how do we love our neighbor? But it's not just the person that lives next to us, right? Growing up in New York City, I grew up in New York City, and my parents were very fortunate to buy a house. Now, if I had a picture of the house, it'd be really tiny, really tiny. And the block that I grew up in, you see in the Midwest, you guys call it streets, we call them blocks. On the block that I grew up in, the houses were really tight. I can look out the window and I can see what my neighbor's cooking. Right, I had friends that live in apartment buildings. There are people that there would be 100 people living on one floor. My grandmother lives in an apartment building, she lives on the 14th floor. There's at least 100 people living on her floor. There's 10 apartments with 20 people living inside. And the only thing that's separating my grandmother's apartment from her neighbor is a wall. Now, here's what happens in New York City. In New York City, you don't really pay attention to your neighbors. You can live next to someone and never know their name. My grandmother passed a couple of months ago, and the neighbor across the street comes. I've known the neighbor since I was a little boy. Can I tell you that I nearly died when the neighbor came across the street? Because I looked at my mom and said, I don't know their name. And my mom says, me either. But we see each other, we know each other. My grandmother made up a name for our neighbor 20 years ago. We've been calling that neighbor Lily. Her name is not Lily. Her name is Tiffany or something like that. For 20 years. Imagine that. You can see someone every single day, not know their name, not know what they're doing, not know what their life is about, and you can overlook them. And James is going to say, there's a better way of living in this world. And one of the ways that you can live really good, if you want a thriving life, if you want a successful life, it's not about money, it's not about power, it's not about influence. You want a successful life, love your neighbor as yourself. So that's what James is going to show us here. I'll read it for us, first 13 verses. If you don't have a Bible, you can just listen to me. James chapter 2, verse 1. This is James, Jesus' little brother. And he's talking to Christians, and this is what he says. He says, my brothers, he's talking to believers, so this includes sisters as well, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, he's talking about a church, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over here, or sit at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? In other words, aren't you treating someone based on their appearance in the wrong way? Verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? He's talking about his kingdom, his rule and reign over all the people who follow him, which he has promised to those who love him. Verse 6, but you have dishonored the poor man. In other words, you have poorly treated someone. You've overlooked someone based on their appearance. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? In other words, you are overlooking the people who are poor, the people who you do not like, and you're giving honor to the very people that want to destroy you. Then he goes on to say in verse 8, if you really fulfill the royal law. We'll talk a little bit about what the royal law is. That's a new idea. According to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. James is quoting an Old Testament law that Jesus repeated on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus' little brother is just saying, hey, remember what big bro told you. Love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. In other words, like I said before, you want a thriving life? You want a successful life? You want to become a better person? Love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 9, but if you show partiality, meaning if you show distinction, if you're discriminate based on someone's appearance, if you show favoritism to someone, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. In other words, you don't love your neighbor as yourself. You think there are certain people who are better than the people who are marginalized. Just remember, you are sinning before God. And if you break that law, you've broken all the laws. Verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, this is God in the Old Testament, and also Jesus himself also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. In other words, if you commit murder, you're just as sinful as the person who committed adultery. You are no different, you are no better. You are a sinner. So then verse 12, James says, so speak and so act as though who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. The question I want us to answer is, why shouldn't we show favoritism? Now, you're looking at me, you're saying, listen, many of us believe the Bible, we're good people, we don't show favoritism to anybody, and I'm gonna call cap on that because all of us show favoritism in some form or fashion, right? You parents, you favorite the youngest child, right, older kids? Am I right or am I right? I am a younger child. I am not the favorite. My sister was. I think I was the black sheep in my family. Here's why. I'm gonna tell you why. I'm gonna tell you why I was the black sheep in my family. Because my parents bought my sister her first car. She had a Grand Am 2-door sedan. If you're in college, you have no clue what that is. For us old folk, we know exactly what a Grand Am was. It was like a light blue. You know what my parents gave me when I got my license? They got me a calling card and it said, good luck. And if you don't know what a calling card is, back in the day, cell phones, and not everyone had a cell phone. But in New York City, there was payphones everywhere. My parents, I'm not kidding you, they bought me a calling card. And they said, hey, listen, we're not gonna get you a car, but we're gonna give you a calling card. If something happens, call us. If something happens, I'm not gonna be here. What do you mean, call you? James is telling us that we shouldn't show favoritism. And how does he do that, he uses this interesting word. If you look back at verse 1, look at it with me really quickly. He says, show no partiality. In other words, James is telling us a command. He's saying, do this. This is not an option. He says, don't show partiality. What does he mean by that? This is interesting. Show no partiality means accepting the face, receiving the face. That was a Greek phrase, and what it meant was, it was meant to convey the idea of making unjust distinctions between people by treating one individual better than others based on outward characteristics. What would be those outward characteristics? Well, the way someone dressed, their income, their platform, their age, their beauty, their education, their youthfulness to me. It signifies favoritism, prejudice, discrimination, racism, or bias, where one person is given preferential treatment over another due to external factors rather than genuine merit or spiritual value. Here's a question. How do you view other people you don't like? How do you view your neighbors? Neighbors are everyone. How do you view people you disagree with? If someone sat next to you in the pew, and let's say you were a little bit more liberal on your politics, and someone walked in with a MAGA hat, how would you feel? What would you say? How would you treat them? Vice versa, maybe you're a little bit more conservative in your politics. Someone came in with a BLM shirt, or someone came in with a liberal shirt that says, my body, my choice. How would you treat them? Oh, we got serious, huh? How would you treat the person that you don't like at the workplace, the obnoxious person, the person that you can't get along with, the person that doesn't shut up? How do you treat them? I joke, but this is the harsh reality, right? Like, I know many of you are saying, Tim, I don't discriminate against anybody. I view people equally. That's a lie. Here's why, because it's in the Bible. God put it in the Bible because our temptation always is to discriminate against other people. Always. It could be race, it could be gender, it can be position, status, whatever it is. Our temptation is to always view people who look differently than us in a bad way. Maybe sometimes, but oftentimes. You know how I know this is true? Because this is the value of our culture. Our world runs on this system. Our culture instinctively asks, what can people do for me? Our culture overlooks the people who are marginalized in our society. Our culture tells us that status is most important because status is the doorway to wealth, power, and influence. In our world, status is a currency. The market rewards appearance, access. Social algorithms on our social media feeds amplify the people who are most impressive, the people who are clever with their words, the people who have a picturesque view of life. Even politics courts those with the highest influence and who can make out the biggest check. But God is different. God doesn't sort people by appearance or advantage. He looks at the heart and he shows no partiality. The reason why James is putting this in this passage is to show us, right, that when we show favoritism to groups of people, it contradicts the very character of God. When you view people differently than yourself, as an opponent, as an enemy, as a person not worth your time, your energy, and your resources, you are contradicting the very heart of God. In other words, when you treat people the wrong way, when you discriminate, when you're racist, when you do not love everyone, you are not demonstrating the love of Jesus Christ. Simple. It contradicts his character. You can't call yourself a Christian if you say, I don't like the other people. You can't call yourself a Christian if you're going to say with your actions, in your words, that the people who are your enemy, the ones that you created as your enemy, are not valuable or worth your time, your energy, and your resources. And I'm not preaching at you or to you. I'm preaching to myself because I can get sucked into the culture of this world. Trust me, I have a listen, I'm gonna be transparent. I have a difficult time caring, loving, giving attention to the people who I disagree with politically. Because I don't get it. I don't like it. But Jesus doesn't tell me, hey, be friends with the people who you agree with. Jesus says, be friends and love the people who don't look like you, who don't talk like you, who don't act like you, who don't dress like you. It contradicts his heart. It contradicts his character. And what is his character? Is loving, kind, gracious, merciful, benevolent. To who? To everyone. You know, someone told me this. They said, Jesus loved so well that even the disciples didn't know Judas was going to betray him. Do you get what that means? Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him, and yet Jesus allowed Judas in his inner circle, and he loved him and spent 3 years with him. Imagine that. Imagine that Jesus allowed someone in his circle of influence who he knew from the very beginning was going to betray him. He knew that Judas was going to be the person that was going to help the Sadducees and the Pharisees crucify him. And Jesus says what? Sure. Be part of my family. Jesus loved so well that even the disciples didn't know Judas was going to betray him. This is the reason why James puts this here, is to reorient the way we view other people. The gospel reorients the way we view each other. And James is telling us that we ought to view them how Jesus views them. So why is favoritism so bad? James says, one, because it contradicts God's character. God doesn't show partiality. God doesn't show favoritism. And two, because simply in verse 6, if you look at it really quickly, it's because it's a sin. James names the contradiction plainly. You're honoring the very people who you are not supposed to honor. Now, I want to say this as a caveat. James is not rebuking wealthy people, right? Because we look at this passage and we think that Jesus is only for the poor and that being rich is bad. No, that's not what Jesus or the Bible is teaching us here. What James is showing us is our motive of the way we treat other people. This was the situation in this church, or the people that God, that James is talking to. These individuals were showing preferential treatment to rich people because they wanted something from them. And they were overlooking poor people, which was wrong, right? It'd be the equivalent of me saying, listen, for those of you who are the high donors of our church, who give a lot of money to the church, you guys get to sit in the first 10 pews, what I call the spit section. You don't give to our church, sit to the back. It would be, say, hey, the single moms who are connected with Akron Pregnancy Services, which we partner well with every single week and do ministry over there, hey, you ladies, you sit in the back because, life doesn't look the same as the other people here. Or the guys, hey guys, the ones that are connected to Haven of Rest, you guys are over there. Listen, we want you to sit in the back. That's what James is pointing out, that we should treat people equally. Why? Because that's God's heart and God's character. When we show preferential treatment, we are sinning. We're sinning against who? We're sinning first and foremost against God. Two, we're sinning against each other. How would you feel if someone overlooked you? How would you feel if someone treated you differently based on your appearance? If you're a college student, how would you feel if someone overlooked you because it's, oh, you're just a college student, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no clue, you don't have life experiences, you just get out of here. You have no voice, you have no opinion, just move to the side. How would you feel? So James is pointing out it's a sin. It's a sin against God, and it's a sin against each other. That's why we shouldn't show favoritism to anyone. Now, this sounds like a simple sermon, but the true heart of the matter is when you walk out of this room, what are you going to do about it? Because many of us, if you're a Christian, a follower of Jesus, we're far more comfortable saying, yeah, I believe that, I understand that, I know that in my heart, but how does that manifest itself in your daily life? Who are your neighbors? Not just the person who's sitting next to you, not the person that lives across the street. Who are the neighbors? Your neighbors who are your enemies. The people you don't get along with. The person you don't like. The person you can't stand. You can't overlook them, James says. May not be poor people for us, but it may be people that we don't think are valuable or important. So James goes on to say in verse 8 through 13, we shouldn't show favoritism because it's a sin, because it breaks the royal law. What's the royal law? James calls it the royal law because it belongs to the king. Who's the king? It's King Jesus. The royal law is a law then would be given to all the citizens of that kingdom. So James is telling us, hey, if you are part of God's kingdom, meaning you believe that Jesus is king, you follow him as king, you want to be like the king, you live in his rule and reign, if you show favoritism, you're breaking this law because this law comes from him. This royal law comes from Jesus himself. And what does he say this law is? The law is you shall love your neighbor. Verse 8, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. What is James telling us here? James is telling us that love is not a vibe. Love is not a feeling. Love is a demonstration. Love is an action. Love is to show someone care, support, value, and worth, even when you don't feel like it. And I'm sure I can ask many married couples here. If you're married for a long time, I'm sure there was one point in your marriage. Don't nod your head, don't make an eye contact because you don't want your spouse to find out. But I'm sure at some point in your marriage that love was not a feeling. And day in and day out for that season, you had to work really hard to demonstrate what you didn't feel. Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. What does that mean? It means to love someone the way you would care and love for yourself. We live in a culture, we live in a world that is focused on me. We live in a culture that is self-centered around what we feel and what we think. Trust me, I love myself really well. I care for myself really well. I have no problem having a really good dinner for myself. I have no problem going to Texas Roadhouse and having a feast because it is a good meal for me. I have no problem going to the outlets and getting a nice shirt for myself, as you can see. And you will make a comment afterwards. I have no problem caring about what I care about. I have no problem being excited about the things I'm excited about. But can I say the same thing for someone else? If I'm honest, it is hard to love other people. It is hard to love you guys. And I'm sure it's hard to love me because we're different. We think differently. We behave differently. We have different values. But Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself, to fulfill the law. Jesus' own words in the Sermon on the Mount goes beyond what James is saying and says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he references, you ought to love your enemy as yourself. This is a high standard Jesus makes for his believers. Why? Because Jesus is more concerned about you becoming more like him, and he's less concerned about your preferences. Because Jesus knows that your preferences are sinful. Jesus knows, right, that at the heart of hearts, in your heart, you long to make yourself bigger and greater than God. And Jesus says, I want you to be like me. I want you to be different than the world. I want you to be different than how the world thinks. So the way you're gonna be different, the way you're gonna look like me is by loving the people that you very hate. Why? Because I love the people who hated me. Think about that. Do you know that Jesus loved the people who hated him? Jesus, before he dies, you know the words that he hears? Crucify him, crucify him. They wanted him dead, and yet he died for them. Jesus died for his enemies. Would you die for your enemy? Do you love your enemy? Can you love your enemy? Can you love a person who doesn't think like you? Would you love someone that way? Jesus loved us that way. The standard is high. And the reason why the standard is high, because Jesus wants you to be like him and not like yourself. And you might be sitting there, you're saying, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm awesome, I'm great. Look at me, I have a great set of hair. I had great clothes, my life is great, my family is great. Why would he want me to be like him? You know why Jesus wants you to be more like him? Because you are a sinner. Because without Jesus, your life looks just like the world. Now, I'm not attacking people in the world. I am attacking the systems and the culture and the belief systems of our world. Jesus wants you to be different. Are you different? Can you honestly say that you're different in the way you love your neighbor? Can you say that you're different in the way you care about the people who don't look like you or talk like you? I'm reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember that parable? It's a parable that Jesus gives, right? Jesus tells the story of a Good Samaritan, a priest and a Levite, a priest, right, who has a good moral compass, good ethics, who thinks wisely, and a Levite. A Levite was someone who worked for God, a minister of God, right? And they pass by a Samaritan. And then a Samaritan draws near, sees that there's someone in need, has compassion, acts immediately, and yet the priest and the Levite, who is supposed to know God's law, who's supposed to know God's heart, who's supposed to do what God tells them to do, doesn't do what God actually wants them to do. And in this parable, Jesus shows us, right, that we ought to be good neighbors. And being a good neighbor means that we love the people who we don't like just as much Jesus loves them. And then in verses 12 to 13, James introduces the idea of mercy. He says, mercy triumphs over judgment. And we have to overcome favoritism. We have to constantly combat our temptation to treat people differently. So how do we do that? How do we combat this feeling? How do we combat this action? How do we combat this sin? And James points us to this idea of mercy. And what James is trying to say in this short little section is, hey, you want to overcome the temptation of showing people favoritism. You want to overcome that? Think about what God has done for you first. Think that when you were a sinner, far away from God, where you didn't believe in him, you didn't trust him, you didn't follow him, your life was a mess, your life was a wreck, and in God's mercy, he saved you. Remember that. Remember the time that you were living your life for yourself. You weren't living for him. You were anxious and overwhelmed. You were angry and you were bitter. You were self-centered. You were a liar. You were a cheater. You were a thief. And God, in his mercy, meaning God saw you and had compassion. God saw you and said, you're worth saving. A couple of weeks ago, I went to New York, had a lot of family drama over the last couple of months. And in some gathering that I was at, a longtime friend was there. And this friend said, I haven't seen this friend in like 15, 20 years, and I grew up in a small little Pentecostal church. And this person I haven't seen since I left New York City said, I remember you when you were obnoxious. I remember you when I couldn't stand being around you. You were self-centered, egotistical. You always had an opinion and you loved sharing that opinion. And as I'm standing there, I'm just like, yeah, I'll show you something, all right. I'll show you who I was. That old man has no problem coming back. But I'm just smiling and said, you're right. And they said, I can't believe that you're a pastor. And I said, me either. I felt sad in that moment. Because you know what? That person remembered who I was. But you know what mercy says? Mercy says, that's not who you are anymore. I'm not that person who I used to be. I'm not the person I used to be 3 months ago, and I'm not the person I used to be, right? I remember my father used to tell me, or someone used to tell me that every time the devil reminds you of your past, you remind him of your future, of his future. Because there's this idea that oftentimes we're always going to remember the person that we used to be. But James says that mercy shows us that we're not that person anymore. That God created a new person. Don't you want to be joyful? Don't you want to experience the fullness of life? The Bible says that you can only experience that through Jesus Christ. I remember when I got saved, I was in college, or I think I was a freshman in college. I've shared this story before. I was sitting in church, and if you grew up in a Pentecostal church, we like to party, man. The services are 2.5 hours long, and that's just the song. That's not the sermon. They sang this song. They kept repeating it over and over again. I was in the back pew. I was all the way in the back, right in front of the sound booth, and I was standing there singing the song and closed my eyes, and they started repeating this one line, and I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. And they kept singing it and singing it and singing it. And I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon the cross. And I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. And in that moment, everything that I've ever done wrong came to my mind. And I was overwhelmed with this idea. I am not worthy of God's grace and mercy. I'm not worthy of him to love me. I'm not worthy for him to save me. I deserve hell. I deserve torture. I don't deserve whatever he has for me. And in that moment, the only thing I can hear, and I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. And it was in that moment that God saved me, not because I was a good person. In fact, he saved me because I was the worst person. He saved me and gave me a new life. so that I can serve him and be like him and live with him forever. That sounds crazy, I know, but I'd rather be crazy in God's kingdom. I'd rather be insane believing in Jesus. I'd rather people criticize me for believing in Jesus than to never not know him. I can't tell you, my life is hard, your life is hard, but let me tell you something. There's something about being with Jesus. There's something about knowing him intimately that when I view life, my difficulties and my problems, I know that I'm not doing it on my own. When I struggle in my sin and I beat myself up, his word tells me you are enough, not because of your good works, but because what my son did for you, because you'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. And that is a free gift, the free gift of Jesus, to give you what you don't deserve. Don't you want a free gift? What's the worst thing that could happen? That your life gets better? That you're more joyful, you have purpose and meaning in life, that you can love people better, that when this world is going to hell, when this world is overwhelmed with problems, you have a sure foundation on Jesus Christ that says you have received mercy and you can love people and show them the gift that God has given you. Isn't that awesome? I don't know about you this morning. You can clap for that. Yeah, sure, you can clap. We love our neighbors because Christ loved us first. God is not looking for you to do it perfectly. He's looking for you to do it faithfully. God doesn't expect you to be perfect. Jesus did that. God expects you to be faithful. Who is your neighbor? Who's the neighbor that you can love well because you've received mercy? Because mercy triumphs over judgment. Who's the person in your life that is difficult to love, but you can love them more by demonstrating the love of Jesus? I think about college students often because I was saved during that time. But I also think in the culture and the world that we live in, college students, young people, Gen Zers are often given a bad rap. They said they're not worthy, they're not good enough, they can't do it, they have too many problems, they're not committed. And I think like one of the ways that we can love people well is loving college students. We're a church that sits right across the street from the University of Akron. Who better than to love college students? My desire as a church is that we leave a lasting impression in the city of Akron. I am not content with the status quo. I want to double down on college students because they're the future generation that's going to lead this church. This is the generation that is going to bring the gospel to places that we have yet reached. I think of one, I'm gonna mention him, Blake Smith. Blake Smith came to faith in college ministry. Blake is now on staff as our student pastor. If it wasn't for Campus Focus, we wouldn't have a Blake Smith on our staff. If it wasn't for Campus Focus, we wouldn't see all these college students right here. Raise your hand. If you're in the college ministry, raise your hand. Yeah. Where would they be at a 10:40 on a Sunday morning? Here.
This has been a message from the chapel in Akron, Ohio. Thanks for joining us today. Our Sunday morning services are at 9 and 10:40 a.m. You can join us online for our services by going to akronlive.thechapel.life. For more information about the chapel, please visit our website at thechapel.life.
Plainly, we're gonna ask for money. We're gonna raise $500,000. $500,000 is a big number, but I think we can do it. The chapel has always been on mission to reach our city and our world. And part of our action plan, we want to reach this next generation. So we're gonna buy a third house. We're believing God to give us a third house. In fact, we are working on that right now. And we want to provide affordable housing for college students for these 3 houses. We want them to be in community. Why? So that they can reach more college students. I don't know, I think there's like 10,000 students at the University of Akron, maybe 15,000, I don't know. Whatever the number is, that's the number I want to reach for the gospel. And we're gonna do that to the day we die. Reach college students. So we're gonna buy a third house. Also too, there are over 300 college students that meet in the auditorium on Thursday nights. Dan and Kayla cannot manage, disciple, evangelize over 300 college students. That's just really hard for them to do. So we need to hire a third person. So part of the $500,000 is to buy that third home, renovate the 3 houses, and is going to help us hire a third person to do discipleship, to do mentorship, to do evangelism. We really want to create a gospel community that reaches the college students at the University of Akron. You know why? Because many students, like me, back then are hopeless. They're worried about the future. And we have a hope. That hope has a name. And that name is Jesus. So would you partner up with us in doing this? Over the next couple of weeks, we'll talk more about what that actually looks like. There's gonna be a table in the back where Nate Braun's gonna be. Dominic is also gonna be there as well. You have questions, you can talk to them about it. But let's pray. We're going to sing out. We're a little late.